Hi, thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by Jason Schisler of Vision Quest Coaching based out of Chicago. The title of the webinar is Winter Training, Do Something Off with Your Off Season. Just some quick housekeeping items. You can ask a question on the right-hand side in the panel there. We're going to collect questions, and then at the end we'll ask your questions to Jason. If we happen to run out of time, Jason can follow up in a blog post. We'll also be recording this webinar, so you can find that in the next couple of days up on our blog as well. My name is Dave Schell. I'm the Education Manager here at TrainingPeaks, and I'm joined by Frank Pipp, who will be collecting those questions for us. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason Schisler.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Dave. This is going to be a little bit of a different type of a webinar than what I've usually been a part of myself and what I think a lot of people probably listen to. Those are oftentimes talking about specific ways that you deal with situations in training, or how to make yourself better, or how to look at your training better and things like that. This is going to be a little bit more like a case study in one sense, where I'm partially just telling my own story about how I've transitioned through endurance sports over the course of 10 or so seasons, and kind of giving that as an example, and then talking a little bit later on about how you might include something like that in your own training. One of the things that I'm going to talk about a lot is sort of the idea of being a dual sport athlete, and we're kind of familiar with the term multi-sport, usually looking at triathlon and triathletes. I'm thinking a little bit more of someone that's trying to be really good or really disciplined and focused in two different sports, not necessarily at the same time, but maybe over different parts of their seasons. And there's different ways that you can do that. We'll talk a little bit about that, as well as what ways you might want to try to integrate this, how you maybe start, what expectations you would have as you go back and forth between different sports. So a little bit more about my background. My history is with a kinesiology degree from Wheaton College. I started from there working with Vision Quest, which I've been with them for 9 years now, and I'm serving as director of coaching for the past 5. My athletic background, just to sort of set the stage for what I'm going to be talking about, was some basic team sports in high school: football, swimming, and track. Then in college, I swam for 1 season, but I had already started to get bitten by the cycling bug a little bit. Initially, it was kind of recreational cycling, becoming a little bit more competitive later in college. Then after I got out of college, I was working with Vision Quest and focused primarily on cycling at first, eventually transferring into cross-country skiing, and then ultimately into road and trail running. So the cycling phase was something that started initially because it was fun, it was new. It allowed me to get out and see more things than what I'd ever really experienced before in, the high school team sports. I wanted to race, but mostly what I was doing was training because it was fun, trying to train and prepare for racing. A lot of it was pretty unstructured. It was just riding mostly. As I got more and more serious about it, I started reading different books and trying to follow something resembling an organized training plan. Ultimately ended up with a power meter, and that was where training really started to become more specific for me. After college then, I started racing more actively. There's all kinds of different levels of how engaged people are in racing. Some are racing multiple times every weekend, others are once a month. I was sort of in the middle of that, made some good progress. I was having fun, building my fitness. And I actually got to a point where after 5 years or so, I was really in the best shape I'd ever been on the bike. My numbers were great. I was performing well in races. I trained really hard over the winter, and I was excited to see how that would translate into results on the road. But the first little inkling that I had that maybe this was something that was starting to go away for me was I was driving to a race, and as I was about 10 minutes away, I just sort of had this feeling that I didn't really want to do that race today. And I had mentally a lot of confidence. My fitness was good. I was excited for the race. It was one that I'd done before and had a little bit of expectation about how it might go or what I could see on the course. So I just sort of put that thought aside, and I'm like, that was weird. I don't know why that happened. Went ahead and did the race, came back and started trying to get back into the training routine the next week, and really just didn't feel motivated at all. I started to have kind of up and down numbers and wasn't really sure what to make of that. So I sort of persisted through the summer with the cycling thing and tried to make the best of it, but in the off season I still didn't really have any motivation, and had always sort of had this goal of starting to cross-country ski a little bit more. I had very, very minimal cross-country ski experience. I had a set of classic skis that I took out and pounded around the golf courses a few times, but I decided that I wasn't really into the cycling thing so much anymore. I wanted to try the Birkie, which is one of the biggest races in the country, or is the biggest race in the country. So with no previous ski history apart from just these golf course sessions, I got a set of skate skis, did the 2009 Birkie, suffered a lot, but had a great time. In my head, I was still considering myself a cyclist. I know for myself and for a lot of the other endurance athletes that I've met, whatever your sport is, you sort of identify yourself a little bit in that sense, whether you're a runner or a swimmer or a triathlete or whatever else you might be. When people meet you and ask you what you do, it's one of the first things that you tell them and sort of identify yourself with. So it was a little bit of an identity crisis for me, that I had always told people and thought to myself that I was a cyclist, and now here I am working for a company where I'm coaching cyclists. I'm still expected to be a cyclist, but not really feeling like that's what I wanted to do. So I sort of got back into the cycling mode a little bit. I set some goals thinking that I needed something to keep me on target, but my mind kept telling me that I was a skier. I kept thinking about Birkie. You know, it's one of those classic things where you do the event, you suffer a lot, it's super hard, you tell everyone that it was awful and you'll never do it again, but then a week later you've sort of forgotten how long or how hard it was, and you want to get back there and try to improve your results or something else. This Birkie thing and sort of planning that I would do it again. And then that following winter, I got a set of roller skis and pursued it a little bit more actively. It became the dominant thing that I was doing, to the point where I wasn't really riding the bike or skiing as much as I could. And that persisted then for a few more years. I did come back to cycling a little bit in the summers. I got a little bit more into mountain bike racing, where I'd done more road racing stuff in the past. And so that was a good way for me to sort of stay fit and stay engaged through the summers. I would set sort of one big goal, which was usually the Schwamigan mountain bike race. I would do that and then transition straight over to skiing, and mostly just focus on skiing all through the winter months. And then after a few years of skiing, one of my skiing friends sort of talked me into getting into some running stuff. He was kind of an ultra endurance runner himself, and my first experience was through crewing for him for a 100-miler. But I'd always sort of liked the idea of being able to run. It seems like such a fundamental thing that we should be able to do, but so many people have let themselves get away from it. They've forgotten how to run well. They're not used to the impact and things like that. So like a lot of them, what would happen to me when I started trying to run was that I would end up injured pretty quickly. I wanted to be good or run fast as quickly as I could, and I would start running too hard or too fast, too many miles and things like that. Finally, I got to a point where, having crewed for this friend at the 100-miler, started to do a little bit of trail running myself. I was ready to really try running. And because I was running on trails rather than the roads that I'd always tried to run on before, I think my body was able to adapt to that a little bit more easily. And for the first time in several years of attempting this, I was able to build up enough endurance and durability to run fairly consistently. It started with just a half marathon trail race and a relay race. But then that next season, following the ski season, got talked into doing a longer ultra relay where I ran a 50K, and then later on a 50-miler that one summer. As it turned out, running was a lot less awful than I had always sort of imagined it would be. You know, prior to starting to actually run, I was like, no, I don't want to run. It's boring. There's nothing fun about it. It hurts, and why would I want to subject myself to that? But as I started making some progress, and especially in trail running, it was similar to some of the mountain biking that I'd done, where you have this sense of moving quickly through the woods and things, and so that was fun. But as my fitness improved too, I started to just enjoy that actual improvement in the fitness itself. And so now the season has gone from being split sort of between skiing and cycling to skiing and running, and the bike is even taken a backseat further, where it's pretty much just a cross-training tool at this point for me. So why did all these changes happen? There were a bunch of different reasons, and I probably don't even really fully understand some of them. But one of the big ones was that I was injured. At times, cycling was pretty hard on both my body and the equipment. I'd broken several bones, different parts of the bike. Starting in the beginning categories in cycling, those of you that have been there know how dangerous that can be and unpredictable. And it seemed like I was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. And after that first Birkie season, I'd set one primary goal of trying to race in the Illinois State Criterium Championships. It was a course that I'd performed well on before, and one that I always had a good time. I thought it was a fun course to race on. And sure enough, I get into that one race, and early on I end up in a crash and break my collarbone. And so being something that I wasn't that interested in anymore, to come away from an injured was just sort of a real kick in the teeth, and something that put that nail in the coffin a little bit more. The other thing was that I just sort of got bored with it. And like I said earlier, I'm not really sure why that happened. Perhaps it was just something that I burned myself out a little bit from training and having a lot of focus on the bike. But despite having the best fitness that I've ever had, racing just wasn't fun for me anymore. The other thing that started to make these changes happen or more interesting for me was that I was motivated by the new challenges. Berkey initially was something that scared me, and for those of you that have taken on big challenges like that, that's one of the things that can be the most motivating, is that you have something that you're sort of afraid that you won't be able to finish. And so you train persistently and diligently to try and get through that, just so that you don't embarrass yourself, let alone anyone else that you think might be watching you. And ultimately, that consistency and that dedication to training was something that started to make me more successful at those endeavors, both in skiing and in running. So the fourth thing that really started to make them fun was that I was making progress and I was seeing the results of that. On the bike, it was something that I had sort of gotten to the point where I felt like I was about as far as I was realistically going to go. We all have our genetic potential and our limitations in training time and things like that. And although I was performing well and I was really happy with those results, I was sort of stuck at a point where the effort that I was putting in wasn't really bringing the results anymore, and that sort of made it less enjoyable to just get out there and really try and keep pushing as hard as I had been. The new experiences too were a big thing that made those new sports fun. Skiing took me to places that I'd never been before. It showed me terrain that I'd never seen before, and even differently, it showed me a part of the year that I'd never seen before. On the bike, you tend to dread the snow because it's something that keeps you from enjoying your pastime. It forces you inside. No one really likes to ride the trainer, apart from a few crazy triathletes that I've heard of. But skiing, you're out and you're able to take advantage of the weather, enjoy the snow, you see the seasons and are a part of that. And in a different way, the same thing has happened with running. There's new races that I'd never been a part of, whole new communities as well. So you start to make new friends in different sports. The last thing I mentioned a little bit already was just that I actually had the season. Not just that I was able to participate in the seasons of the year and see the change in spring to summer to fall to winter, but I had seasons of my training. I didn't have to focus on one thing year-round. When I was on the bike, it was pretty much the bike year-round, starting with the road racing in the early spring, March or April, all through the summer, and then transitioning into cyclocross for the fall, and a little bit of time off maybe in December through February or March, but you're still pretty much always on the bike and you're doing the same thing repetitively. With this, I had something that could sort of break it up where I was focused on skiing roughly from October through the end of February, and then the end of February I would transition over to cycling, and then now to running, and have that focus through the summer, and then look forward to starting up the skiing again come winter. So who is this right for? It's really for anyone that wants to try something different. Everything up to this point has sort of been me just kind of telling my story about how I got to where I am right now and why it worked out for me this way. I've tried this with a few of my athletes too, and I think as a coach, it's something that has really been beneficial for me and helped me to understand a little bit more about why athletes or how they're responding to their situations. Admittedly, my job and position is pretty non-stressful compared to a lot of people that might be managing companies or doing things that are a lot more inherently stressful than what I'm doing. But at the same time, all of these things factor into the balance of life. And when you get to a point where the thing that you've been doing to maybe give you some balance or give you a little bit of an outlet and a stress relief becomes less fun, then it just adds to the stress too. So in this example, for me, cycling was the thing that was not as fun as it used to be. I've encountered other athletes that I've coached on the bike that have gotten a little bit burned out as well, and suggested that they maybe try to add something in. The times when this makes the most sense is when you're at the end of your season and you're sort of finished up with your primary goals. It's a great way to stay fit with less pressure from your primary sport. Just because you're not training on the bike, for instance, doesn't mean that you're not maintaining a high level of fitness. Another time is when you're burned out and not sure why. Sometimes that change is really just a great thing to sort of reinvigorate yourself, as well as give you some new energy, and the new experiences too help you get motivated and excited about what you might be doing next. When you've hit a plateau, this is one that I don't think is necessarily applicable for everyone, but at least in my case, what I found was as I started to have a more seasonal training system, I actually got better on the bike even though I was training it less. When I was riding on the bike strictly, I would train somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 miles a year, very structured, threshold intervals, VO2 intervals, sprints, long rides, group rides, all of those different things that you're supposed to do as a cyclist to be at your best. But when I stopped doing that exclusively and started training more in skis in the winter, I would put in a high volume of aerobic training. A lot of it ended up sort of being a little bit of a tempo or threshold intensity. And so I got that benefit from that aerobic fitness, even though it was non-specific to cycling. I came out of that oftentimes pretty fresh on the bike, and there's a little bit of a transition time that I'll talk about in a bit. But what I found was that when I started to focus more and more on the bike, I had a window where I could be really focused, and because I still had a high level of fitness overall, once that fitness transitioned back to the bike, I was in a great place to build up for a few events. The other time is, and I think this is the most important one, is when you're not having fun anymore. If the thing that you're doing for fun isn't fun, then really there's no reason left to pursue it. These are examples that are sort of still endurance focused, but I think that's an important thing across the board too. I remember one of the people that sort of got me into cycling initially, I talked to him when I was first going through this period of being unsure about the bike and everything. What was it? What did I have to do to try and get back to where I loved it? His recommendation was to just stop for a while. And he said if I really wanted to come back, I would. And I think I found other things that sort of filled that void for me. But a lot of other people that I've known that have gone through similar situations ultimately start to miss it. And sometimes it takes a long period of time. The common thing that we see with a lot of our clients at Vision Quest is maybe they raced when they were younger. They got busy with their jobs and families and things like that, had several years away from it, realizes that they started to miss it, and ultimately in their upper 40s or early 50s, they're able to come back to it and start to enjoy it again. So what does this actually mean for you? One of the key things that I want to get across is that you can follow your own model. The way that I've done this is just an example. It's not the right one or the only one. And for a lot of people, my model may not even work. It worked out great for me in the upper Midwest where we have these seasonal changes. We have access to snow and things like that. But if you were living in Florida or California or somewhere like that, skiing isn't going to be a realistic option for you. That doesn't mean you still can't become this dual sport athlete or focus on bringing something new into your training. There's some examples here for different opportunities that might be more convenient. Water sports could include rowing, kayaking, windsurfing, paddleboarding. Snow sports could be skiing or snowshoeing, and downhill skiing is also a good one. If you're looking for more endurance type focus, you could do backcountry or randoneering type skiing. You're going to get that downhill adrenaline rush as well as some of the aerobic component when you're doing more of the climbing type efforts. Team sports are also great, and they give you a whole different dynamic where there's less of an endurance focus, but as long as you're moving pretty consistently, you're staying active, ultimately becoming more athletic too. That's one of the big things that we really try to emphasize with our Vision Quest athletes in the off season is to gain back some of their athleticism, whether they're a cyclist or a triathlete. Athletes tend to get so focused on moving forward and very linear in their movements that they become a little bit less athletic and less prepared to deal with the dynamic changes that you have to be prepared for in team sports. Challenge events are another great one. The Tough Mudder, a few crazy people might try something like the Ninja Warrior. Along the same vein, strength training like CrossFit or the CrossFit Games are a great option. Something that's completely different than what you do. You could also throw normal endurance sports in there, cycling, swimming, running. But the key thing is to try and do something that's way different than what you normally do rather than just an analog of what you are already doing. For instance, when I was racing the bike, I would race road in the summer and then I would transition to cyclocross. And it was refreshing in a way because it was a different environment, different types of efforts, terrain, race tactics, things like that. But ultimately, I'm still riding almost the same bike since the position was set up to be the same. Even if you're racing the mountain bike, again, and you're still pedaling in circles, and there's not that much change. If you're a cyclist, you could switch to anything else where you're moving in different ways, where, especially if you have some lateral components of that. There's two different approaches that I think would potentially work for different types of athletes. One is to kind of dip your toe in the water, and the other is to jump right in. And I think the first season that I did this, I was a little bit more of the dip the toe in the water type person. I was skiing through the off season, and I was trying to make sure I got enough training in to be prepared for Berkey, but I was also still a cyclist. So I was training several times a week on the bike, still doing intervals through the winter a little bit the way that I normally would have in the past, and just replacing some of the other workouts with ski workouts. When you're doing this, you want to start slowly and add just a few workouts of that new activity in. Limiting the intensity is important, and focusing on developing your skills and economy. One of the most important things, I think, anytime you take on a new sport is to become proficient at doing that sport and moving correctly, efficiently. You're going to prevent yourself from injury that way. You're also going to become more efficient, and I think as you become more efficient, you'll be able to relax a little bit more, enjoy the sport more, and then ultimately get more benefit out of it. If you go out there and you're working in an inefficient way, and it's always going to be harder, and you're going to be so limited in the amount of time that you can complete it just because you'll fatigue, that it'll be hard for it to become something that you really fully enjoy. The other thing to be aware of when you first start a brand new activity is that muscular endurance may be the biggest limiting factor. If you're taking on cross-country skiing or swimming from a cycling or running background, you probably have a great cardiovascular endurance ability, but you're going to lack a lot of the upper body muscular endurance. So that's going to be one of the biggest things that you'll see is you may not feel like you're that winded, but your muscles are starting to fatigue. You wouldn't absolutely need to, but I would encourage anyone that's trying to do this to plan for one race. Try to train up through it and progress just for the sake of trying something new. It doesn't have to be a major performance goal where you want to win or set a best time or anything like that, but something that just motivates you and sort of holds you accountable to this training that you're doing. You should be able to transition back to your primary activity relatively easily. So if you skied through the off season and we're continuing to train on the bike, then a little bit of more specific training and just getting back to your normal routines should have you back to pretty close to your normal level of fitness. Hopefully you were able to develop enough skill where you could actually use this alternative sport to maintain your fitness level and not just as a completely mental refresher. So your fitness level overall should be high, allowing you to get back to your primary sport then. If you're the more intense type of person that really wants to just jump right in, I think this is best if you have some type of experience with this activity, whether it was something that you did as a youth or a high school athlete or maybe even in college and got away from for a while, where you're already proficient with the skills or at least have some muscle memory for those skills. That's something that will come back fairly quickly as you start to get back into the activity. Still expect that you're going to have some of the muscular endurance limiters, and those things will take some time to come up, but hopefully your training in the primary sport has given you a high enough level of cardiovascular endurance so that you're able to build that muscular endurance pretty quickly just through repetition with the sport. Not only will you want to include more frequency, but you also want to start to include a little bit more intensity. Again, that's something that you'll build up to. You wouldn't want to start right away with that, partially just because your body won't be prepared for it. But ultimately, I think when you're trying to progress to a higher level within a different sport, you want to try to develop the ability to change gears, so to speak. Obviously, on the bike, that's something that's very easy to do. It's just a flick of the wrist. But in other sports, changing gears is really a lot more about your effort and your technique. And the thing that I see a lot of times with new athletes starting this is that they sort of have that tempo pace or maybe endurance pace, and that's as hard as they can go. It doesn't really vary much from there, and their range is very narrow. What you want to ultimately try to do is develop some of that same range that you maybe have in your primary sport so that there's a firm distinction between your aerobic system, your threshold system, VO2, and possibly even the sprint system. Because that range is going to be partially a factor of economy, but also a way to actually make that training more specific, where you're training those different energy systems and targeting them specifically rather than relying on just general fitness carrying you through. Once you're doing that, you can plan more competitive events or maybe even a full season of racing in this alternative sport, be ready to give something up as you transition back to your primary sport as well. Oftentimes when I'm skiing, that's all I'll do for the winter. And so this past winter, I think I maybe rode the bike 3 times between November and December, or November and February rather. I was running a little bit, so the transition back to running was fairly easy for me, but the transition back to the bike was something that was very hard because I had no experience on it. I still have some of the muscle memory, so riding for an hour or 2 hours maybe isn't a huge deal, but once you stretch beyond that, it's harder to sustain that level of power that I could in the past, or where I've noticed it more specifically has been when I try to do intensity. The feeling of intensity on the bike to me now is something much different than what I remember it being when I was training strictly on the bike. Really, I feel like I get out there and I just don't remember how much I had to focus all the time to just keep up the power, trying to generate numbers during intervals and things like that. At the same time, if I was to go out and try and do that running now or skiing, it would be something that's very familiar to me because that's the way that I've been training. The nice thing about being able to, or completely immersing yourself in that sport is that I find it's something that you're able to keep a fairly high level of fitness year-round. You're transitioning from one sport into another one. There'll be that period of transition time where maybe you're recovering a little bit, but at the same time you're mentally refreshing yourself. And by the time you're getting back to a point where you're feeling mentally engaged and energized about your training, then you should be at a point where your fitness level is starting to be maximized again too, and you're building up through the course of that season. And then again at the end of it, you're taking that high fitness level, transitioning that fitness into a different sport and building back up for that one again. And so with that little bit of transition time, you can keep that level of fitness pretty high year-round rather than the traditional model of a single sport athlete of training up through the winter, taking some time off because they're burned out and they need it to recover, and then having to build back up again through the next season. A couple of specific concerns for people to think about it, and everyone's probably seen this sort of fun image of what people think they look like when they run or feel like, and then what they actually look like. Our perceptions can be completely different. Whether you're running or skiing or swimming, any of these things that are very skill dependent, it's so important to develop the proper technique and efficiency so that you're exercising safely and also having fun with it. Considering professional instruction early on is something that's really great, especially if this is your first foray into these different sports, because it's much easier to develop good habits from the start rather than training through on your own and developing the bad habits and then finding out later that those are things that you need to change. People that have been in different sports before, or even just in primary sports, will know that techniques are always changing. Recommendations are evolving as people think that they have the answer to the most efficiency and things like that. So what you start with may not ultimately be what you end with, but at least to get started on the right foot, start with some good instruction, somebody that can help you to do that. That's not to say don't go out and watch YouTube videos about how to do different skills correctly and practice those, but try to gain that awareness of your body and also have some feedback from someone else, even if it's just having someone that can come out and film you doing this new sport so that you can get an external perspective of what it looks like rather than just relying entirely on how it feels for you to be working out. Two other things that are a little bit more specific for cyclists, or really for any kind of non-impact based athlete, maybe a rower or a swimmer, allow some time to adapt if you're transitioning into an impact-based sport. Cyclists that have transitioned into running have probably experienced that feeling after the first run where they felt great during the run, they had good cardiovascular endurance, but then the next day and then the rest of that next week maybe, they're feeling like their calves and their quads and their hamstrings are just on fire and everything hurts. And it all comes because they're not used to the eccentric contractions that happen during impact-based sports, particularly like running. Skiing is a lot easier to transition into because although you are weight-bearing, you don't have the high impact like you would in running. So just allow some time to build up to that. Start very slowly at low intensities and ideally on soft surfaces, and I think that will make that transition a lot easier for you. Triathletes have a little bit more of a challenge in some ways than some of the other type of single sport athletes because they're already doing 3 sports in the course of their normal training. So finding something that's completely different and out of the norm for them may be a bigger challenge. At the same time, maybe they don't quite need to as much because they are already engaged in those different things. But if it was something where they were looking for a new sport to kind of refresh them and help motivate them through the off season, then finding that different thing could be a little bit of a challenge. The other thing that I didn't mention here too is to think about how this dual sport fits within your overall goals. If you're someone that's been doing one sport for a long period of time and just feel like you're burned out and looking for a change, maybe you don't need to think about that right now, and that's something that you can sort of figure out as you go along. But if, for instance, you are a cyclist or a triathlete or a runner or whatever athlete you are, and you have firm goals for that sport in the future, you want to think a little bit more concretely about how this dual sport approach integrates with your overall goals. Maybe it's a matter of being more of the sort of toe in the water type athlete where you continue progressing for those primary sports and engaging in that type of training year round, but break it up a little bit by including some of the different things and letting that second sport take over a little bit more of the general type training that you do. Maybe you don't need to be spending the time doing your long aerobic workouts in your primary sport. Maybe even your tempo work can be done in that primary or in that alternative sport, but then use the primary sport still for your key intensity workouts that are focused on skill development and speed work and things like that. So then the other aspect of all of this is how does this integrate with coaching? And we'll talk to the athlete's perspective first. Some people may be thinking, okay, this is maybe something that sounds like a good idea for me. How do I want to approach this with my coach? The first thing is, how will your coach feel about your participation in this other sport? Are they going to be on board with your needs, or are they even going to be skilled and credible enough to help you in that new sport? At the baseline, do they even need to stay involved? And I don't, as a coach myself, I'm not trying to scare anyone away from their coaching relationships, especially if it's something that's been developed and effective over time. But think about some of these different things as you're considering bringing this up and introducing this new sport. One thing might be that if they have experience, then that's great, and they'll be a huge asset to you as you continue to develop, especially if they have skills and instruction experience there. They don't necessarily need to be experienced in that sport to still be effective for you if you're trying to integrate it with some of your current training. For instance, if you were doing half of your training in one sport, introducing a few workouts as supplements to the others, they can continue to guide your training in your primary sport, but then also focus on just giving you the volume and sort of understanding how much these new workouts take out of you, adjusting the durations as appropriate and things like that. In-person instruction or one-on-one and group settings are a great thing that you might look for if you're trying to get some coaching specific to the sport. Like I said before, I think this is a great thing for someone that's just learning their new sport. Trying to get off on the right foot will set you up for success as you progress with it, and then ultimately it'll help to make it more fun. The biggest reason why these new sports were fun for me was because I was seeing progress from them, which I hadn't seen on the bike. The other part of coaching is the daily and weekly plan prescription. Depending on how you're using this, that part may be more or less necessary. It might be something that you can sort of handle on your own and make your own adjustments, or maybe it's something that if you're building up to a specific event in particular, having the oversight of a coach is something that can help you make sure that you're checking off the appropriate baselines along the way. In either case, the basic tenets of endurance training remain pretty much the same. Ultimately, you're trying to address the different energy systems in a somewhat systematic way. You want to have a high level of aerobic fitness overall. For certain events, you'll want to have a good level of threshold fitness for cruising speed. In other ones that have more variable demands, you want to have a good level of VO2 power as well. And in some, and in fact in most cases, you probably want to have a little bit of a mix of both of those, because nothing is usually completely steady state. There's periods where you're surging, periods where you're sustaining a hard pace, and then almost always there's an endurance component as well. So addressing those key things is the biggest issue, and if your coach can keep that in mind and figure out how those things integrate with your new sport, then they can still be a great asset for you. For the coach's side, you maybe are thinking along the same thing as what the athletes are, but from the other side of it. Do you have experience training or competing or coaching these alternative sports? If you don't, what are the most common ones in your area? If you're in a coastal area, water sports may be a big thing. If you're more in the Midwest, snow sports might be, or the northern tiers, snow sports might be a big thing. Whatever people are actively engaged in your communities, it's worth looking into those. If you have athletes that might be interested, do you have contacts that might be willing to partner with you or advise you on coaching these alternative sports? It's a big opportunity for client potential to look at some of these things. If you've been focused solely on one sport, or even on maybe triathlon coaching, for instance, that's kind of a multi-sport focus, but there's a huge group of athletes that are engaged in something entirely different, becoming involved in this other community creates a huge opportunity for you to generate new clients. Many of the participation events are growing hugely. Tough Mudders and things like that, other participation-focused events that aren't necessarily races, have huge turnouts. And people still want to be fit. They still want to perform. They don't want it to suffer unduly by getting through these events. So it creates an opportunity for coaching. Things like the Berkey have 10,000 people, and so that's a huge market as well that maybe you're not seeing outside of your normal sporting community. Increase diversity and gain access to clients that you wouldn't normally have and interact with by engaging in some of these different communities yourself. If you have clients that are already doing some of this multi-sport or dual sport type of training, maybe what they do in the off season is that they just decide they don't need your coaching services anymore. That you're not prepared to help them out. But if you start to take some interest in that, engage in it yourself, competing, training, build your own credibility, and then be able to actually offer something to them, that might be a great way to help retain them through these off-season months. As I mentioned before, one of the big things that I didn't really anticipate when I was going through this myself was that it prepared me to deal better with athletes who hit plateaus or were losing interest in their primary sport, because I had gone through it myself. I knew what it felt like to not be super interested in what I was doing. I had some ideas about how they might be able to work through it and ultimately get back to having some of that interest in their primary sport. And so if you can have that same experience yourself, even if you haven't gone through the overall sort of crash and burn type cycle, but have just tried some of these different sports, then it gives you an option that you can mention to athletes who do go through some of this. So that basically concludes the story part and some of my recommendations for how you could approach your endurance training as a dual sport perspective. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have about it, but my responses are obviously going to be colored sort of by my own experience and the observations of some of these athletes that I've worked with. So there's no science really involved in this, or at least not the part that I'm talking about. Just some recommendations that you might try out to help hopefully enhance your overall endurance experience and expand your opportunities within the sport. So thanks everyone for coming, and if there's any questions, then I'll be happy to take those.
Can you hear me, Jason?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you hear that question?
No, I missed the question. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that. So as a coach, how do you address the fear of the athlete that they're going to lose all their fitness by switching to a secondary sport for a period? Or how do you convince the athlete that it's okay to take some time off from their primary sport?
That is one of the tough ones. I think one of the common things that I hear from athletes as a coach is that they get to the end of the current season, whether they're oftentimes they've just had a big event that was sort of their capstone thing, whether they had a good experience or a bad experience, they're already turning around and thinking about next year. And I think that's a great approach to have. Having those goals is a great way to keep yourself motivated. But at the same time, it's hard to realistically maintain a high level of fitness in one sport year round. So what I often tell athletes is that it's I think, good for them to lose a little bit just because it gives them room to build back up and it takes that pressure off for a while. That's one of the things that I like about the alternative sports is that it's an opportunity to try something new. And there is certainly a transitional period, and that can be frustrating for the athletes. Initially, at the point when the muscular endurance is still a limiter, they probably will give up some fitness. And I think the key thing when you're trying to do a different sport is to get good enough at that sport that it can suitably replace your primary sports. For instance, if you're a cyclist and normally your endurance ride might be 3 or 4 hours on the weekend, you try to take up cross-country skiing, but you only have the skill and the ability to ski for an hour, then you're not necessarily doing a great job of replacing one sport with another in a way that still continues to support your overall fitness goals. So that's a case where an athlete that's trying to integrate a different sport within their primary training would want to really devote some time to trying to build that up and accept that early on they may give up something. But overall, as long as they're maintaining their fitness and continuing to train at kind of a maintenance level in their primary sport, I really do feel that they can build back up to a high level with a reasonable amount of time, maybe a month or so early in the season, so that they're back at close to their preseason fitness from the year prior when they weren't doing the alternative sports. If it's someone that's doing a completely different sport and just focused on that for the off season, that one is a little bit of a tougher one. It can be frustrating early on when you transition back to that primary sport where everything feels a little bit awkward and you've lost some of the power and the speed that you had. But really, they just sort of have to take it on faith that they will get back to that level of fitness because they do have a high level of overall fitness. It's just a matter of developing the specific fitness for their primary sport that they're engaged in at the time.
Thank you. Got another question here. If you are a cyclist, for example, how often would you want to do these cross-training activities as you get closer to the primary sports season? For example, if I have my first race on April 1st, should I still be cross-training in February or March?
Again, that's something that depends a little bit about what your overall off-season goals are. If it's something where, with skiing, for instance, you were trying to train for Berkey, you have an event at the end of the season, you would obviously still want to be cross-training then. If you didn't have a firm goal that you were pursuing, ideally you would maybe start back with your primary sport and still have something of an off-season in the kind of traditional cycling sense. With one of the athletes that I've worked with that has gone to a running in the off-season model, what he's done is to sort of work through his summer season, complete his goals, spend about 2 months, maybe 2.5 months building up for a local half marathon and a trail race, and then transitions back to cycling. So that gives him kind of from January on to build back up for March and April races, allowing him to, be back to that high level of fitness where he's really familiar with the way that things feel in that primary sport, which in this case is cycling.
Thanks. Here's another question. For you personally, how long did it take to become comfortable as a dual sport athlete?
The first season, I think, was the most challenging because I hadn't quite figured out exactly what I wanted to do. And I know when I did that first Berkey, I had very, very limited experience. So I actually bought my skis on Christmas Eve and had 2 months basically to go from absolutely no ski experience to trying to ski a 50K race that was going to take 3 to 4 hours. I was fortunate that year that there was actually good snow coverage and I was able to train fairly consistently. But as I look back on it, I remember in January being really scared because I would go out and I would ski for 10 or 15K and that would be all that I had. I would finish those sessions completely spent. Initially, I was trying to do it on my own. I looked at a few videos and things like that, but I didn't really know what I was doing. So I finally went and got some instruction at the end of January. And that instruction for me was so helpful that I went from skiing at sort of a speed of about 6 miles an hour. Now I've transitioned way beyond miles per hour for skiing into minutes per kilometer, which is much more cool and the appropriate thing to be thinking about in terms of pace. But at the time, I was still looking at speed. So I went from 6 miles an hour to about 10 miles an hour and carried that speed over much greater distances just because I learned a little bit more about the form. And that said, that first Berkey that I skied, I still only had essentially one gear. I would ski uphill using the V1 technique for anyone that knows about skiing, and then I would basically skate down the hills, and that's all I had. It wasn't until the second year when I actually started to roller ski a little bit more and spend more time in that sport that I developed some of the different gears. The same thing a little bit happened with running, where the first year that I did that, it took time to build up to where I could actually run and change my speed and have a little bit more variance there. But that was still only kind of a 2-month build up, and then it was on to skiing. So ultimately, I think I was making progress for 3 to 4 years before I felt like I'd gotten close to sort of my plateau, not necessarily a plateau, but close to my potential in that sport. And then it becomes, like it does in any sport, a little bit more of a game of modifying the little details and trying to fine-tune things. You've cut off the big blocks of clay, so to speak, and you're coming back trying to refine the little details to be at your best. What I also found that as I did that, the transitions got a little bit more challenging too, because initially as you're trying to do kind of a toe in the water type approach, you can switch back and forth between the two relatively easily, and you've still got some of the muscle memory from that previous sport. But as you get more and more immersed in one, the transition maybe takes from a couple of weeks to a month rather than being able to just transition within a week, moving from one sport to another.
Great, thanks. Let's do one more question. Using something like CrossFit or the CrossFit Games as an example, would you recommend that an athlete approaches that a little bit more slowly and builds some of that base strength before trying to just jump right into a strength-based sport? If they're coming from...
Absolutely.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I think it's certainly a valid goal to have, and it's something that's completely different, but it's something that you would want to approach more cautiously. A lot of people that are into CrossFit, and maybe even people that aren't, have seen some of the challenges that are out there with it, where there's all kinds of accusations that it's too intense, that people are getting hurt all of the time. And ultimately what that comes down to is it's not that CrossFit itself is bad, but it's because people pursue it too rigorously or too quickly and things like that. The body has a tremendous ability to adapt, but at the same time, sometimes it can outpace its own adaptations. The muscular strength and the actual strength of the muscles themselves grows much faster than the connective tissue, the tendons and the ligaments. So when you're doing these really high power and explosive type movements, some of those weaker tendons and ligaments are going to be at a liable position where they might rupture or be pulled just because the muscle has more strength than what they do. So ideally, that might be something where you're already engaged in CrossFit on some level, and you sort of have a base. If not with CrossFit, then maybe with some other means of strength training, whether it's traditional strength training or even yoga or Pilates or something like that, so that it's not a completely unfamiliar type of a movement. Progress through it at a logical type of a rate where you maybe start with lighter weights and an amount of reps that's appropriate for you. There's certainly going to be some soreness, but not something that should be impossible to recover from. And then have the goal of building up to something like the CrossFit Games rather than transitioning directly into it and expecting to be at your best right away.
Great. So that's all the questions we have. Again, for the attendees, we're going to host this archived webinar on the blog. And if you do happen to come up with more questions for Jason, please send them to us at help.trainingpeaks.com, or I believe that Jason had his contact information on one of the slides there as well. Again, thank you, Jason, for hosting this webinar, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.